My sister stood up at dinner and said my life had destroyed hers just by existing. And that was the moment our parents finally admitted the truth they'd hidden for 28 years. There are words spoken in anger that can never be taken back, words that reveal resentments buried so deeply that when they finally surface, they destroy everything in their path. For me, those words came from my older sister Victoria when she told me that I'd ruined her entire life simply by existing, that every disappointment and failure she'd experienced was my fault. What I didn't know was that her hatred had roots in a family secret that had shaped both our lives in ways neither of us understood. This is the story of how one sister's cruel declaration forced our parents to reveal a truth they'd kept hidden for 28 years, and how that truth explained decades of dysfunction while simultaneously making it impossible to repair the damage already done. My name is Lily, and I'm 28 years old. My sister Victoria is 8 years older than me, 36 now, and for as long as I can remember, she's resented my existence. Growing up, I always assumed this was normal sibling rivalry, the typical older sister annoyed by the younger one who got attention and invaded her space. But Victoria's feelings toward me went beyond normal sibling friction into something darker and more consuming that I never fully understood until recently. Victoria was born when our parents, Robert and Margaret, were young, just 22 and 23 respectively. They'd gotten married right out of college and started their family quickly, and Victoria was their first and only child for 8 years. By all accounts, those 8 years were happy. My parents doted on Victoria, gave her every opportunity they could afford, and built their lives around their small family of 3. Then I came along, an unexpected pregnancy when Victoria was 8 and my parents were 30 and 31. My mother has always said I was a surprise but a welcome one, that they'd thought their family was complete but were thrilled to have another child. My father echoed this sentiment, saying I'd brought new joy to their lives and that Victoria had been excited about becoming a big sister. But Victoria's version of events was very different. According to her, my arrival had destroyed the perfect family dynamic she'd enjoyed for 8 years. She said that before I was born, she'd had her parents' full attention, adequate resources, and a stable, predictable life. After I arrived, everything changed. Attention was divided, money was tighter, and she went from being the center of her parents' world to having to share everything with an intruder. Victoria made her resentment clear in countless ways throughout our childhood. She refused to play with me or include me in her activities. She'd complain loudly if asked to watch me or help with my care. She'd tell me directly that I was unwanted, that the family had been better before I existed, and that she wished I'd never been born. My parents would reprimand her for these comments, but they continued throughout our childhood and into adulthood, becoming more sophisticated but no less cutting as we got older. As we grew up, the dynamic only worsened. Victoria struggled academically and socially in ways I didn't. She had trouble making friends, didn't excel in school despite being intelligent, and seemed generally unhappy and resentful of life. Meanwhile, I was more naturally social, did well in school without much effort, and had an easier time navigating childhood and adolescence. None of this was intentional on my part, but Victoria saw my existence and my successes as direct attacks on her. The financial strain Victoria always mentioned was real. We were solidly middle class but not wealthy, and raising 2 children instead of 1 meant resources were stretched. Victoria's activities had to be limited when I came along and needed childcare, music lessons, and sports fees of my own. Family vacations became less frequent and less elaborate. The college fund my parents had been building for Victoria had to be split to start one for me. These were practical realities of having 2 children instead of 1, but Victoria treated them as personal injustices inflicted specifically by my existence. My parents tried to be fair and equitable, but the age gap meant Victoria and I were always at different life stages requiring different types of support. When Victoria was in high school and college, I was still a child requiring constant supervision and care. When Victoria was supposed to be launching her career, my parents were helping me through high school and college applications. The timing meant my parents' attention and resources were constantly divided, and Victoria never forgave me for that. Victoria went to college but struggled, changing majors multiple times before graduating with a degree she never used professionally. She bounced between jobs throughout her 20s, never finding her footing or building the successful career she'd envisioned. She dated but never maintained long-term relationships. By her early 30s, she was living alone, working in retail management, and generally dissatisfied with how her life had turned out. Meanwhile, I'd followed a more straightforward path. I'd gotten a degree in education, become a teacher, married my college boyfriend Adam when I was 25, and generally built a stable, happy life. None of this was extraordinary or something that should have provoked jealousy, but to Victoria, my normal happy life was evidence that I'd somehow stolen the happiness that should have been hers. The comments continued throughout my adulthood, though they evolved. Victoria would make passive-aggressive remarks about how easy I had it, how things just worked out for me, how I'd never had to struggle the way she had. She'd imply that my success came at her expense, that the resources and attention I'd received had been stolen from her. She was never happy for my achievements, only resentful that I had them. My parents tried to mediate the tension between us, but they always seemed uncomfortable when the topic came up, changing the subject or minimizing the conflict rather than addressing it directly. They'd tell Victoria she needed to let go of her resentment and tell me I needed to be understanding of Victoria's struggles. But they never really explained the depth of Victoria's anger or helped either of us understand where it came from. Things came to a head 3 months ago at a family dinner. It was supposed to be a celebration of my recent promotion to head of my department at the school where I taught. My parents had organized the dinner, inviting Victoria, Adam, and a few close family friends. The evening started pleasantly enough, with congratulations and good food, but the atmosphere shifted after everyone had been drinking for a while. Victoria became increasingly quiet and sullen as people praised my achievement. When someone asked her how work was going, she gave a brief, dismissive answer and then made a comment about how some people just naturally had things work out for them while others had to struggle against obstacles. The comment was clearly directed at me, and an awkward silence followed. My father tried to redirect the conversation, but Victoria wasn't done. She said she wanted to make a toast, and she stood up with her wine glass. What came out of her mouth next was so venomous and shocking that it silenced the entire table. She said she wanted to toast to me, to the person whose very existence had ruined her entire life, who'd stolen her childhood, her parents' attention, her opportunities, and her chance at happiness. She said every disappointment and failure she'd experienced could be traced back to the day I was born and destroyed the perfect family she'd had before. She continued, saying that I'd been a parasite on the family resources, that I'd taken everything that should have been hers, that I was the reason she couldn't achieve her potential. She said my success was built on what had been stolen from her, and that I'd never understood or cared about the damage I'd done just by existing. She said all of this calmly and deliberately, making it clear these weren't drunken words but deeply held beliefs she'd finally voiced publicly. I sat there in shock, unable to respond. Adam put his arm around me protectively, and I could see he was furious on my behalf. My parents looked stricken, and the family friends were staring at their plates in acute discomfort. Victoria sat back down, apparently satisfied that she'd finally said what she'd been thinking for decades, and took another drink of wine like she hadn't just eviscerated her sister at her own celebration dinner. The dinner ended shortly after, with people making awkward excuses and leaving quickly. Adam and I left without saying much to anyone, both of us too shocked to process what had just happened. In the car, Adam said that Victoria's hatred was pathological and that I needed to consider cutting her out of my life entirely. I agreed that what she'd said was unforgivable, but I was also confused about the intensity of her resentment. Normal sibling rivalry didn't explain this level of hatred sustained over decades. The next day, my mother called and asked if I could come over to talk. She said my father would be there too, and that there was something they needed to tell me, something they should have told me years ago but hadn't found the courage to. I agreed to come over, though I was apprehensive about what they might say. When I arrived, both my parents looked exhausted and older than I'd ever seen them. They sat me down in the living room and my father started talking, explaining something that recontextualized my entire childhood and Victoria's resentment in ways I'd never imagined. He said that Victoria had been born when they were very young, as I knew, but that what I didn't know was that my mother had been pregnant with twins. Victoria had a twin brother who died during delivery due to complications. My parents had lost one child the same day they gained another, and the trauma of that experience had shaped everything that came after. Victoria, my father explained, had been told about her twin brother when she was around 5 years old. They'd thought she should know, and they'd framed it as having a special angel brother in heaven. But Victoria had apparently fixated on this loss in ways they hadn't anticipated. She'd developed a grief and longing for the brother she'd never known, had felt incomplete and alone without her twin, and had idealized what their relationship would have been like if he'd survived. My mother took over the story, her voice shaking. She said that for 8 years after Victoria's birth, they'd tried desperately to have another child. They'd wanted to fill the hole left by the loss of Victoria's twin, to give her a sibling, to complete their family. But conception didn't happen, and they'd eventually accepted that Victoria would be their only child. They'd made peace with that and poured all their love and resources into raising her. Then, unexpectedly, my mother got pregnant with me. They were shocked but thrilled, seeing me as a miracle baby who'd come after years of trying. But Victoria's reaction to the pregnancy had been immediate and intensely negative. She'd been told she was getting a sibling, and instead of being excited, she'd been angry. She'd said she didn't want a sister, she wanted her brother, the twin who should have been with her all along. She'd seen me as a replacement, an inferior substitute for the sibling she was meant to have. My father said they'd tried to help Victoria work through these feelings, had taken her to counseling, had reassured her that I wasn't replacing anyone. But Victoria had held on to her resentment. In her mind, if she'd had her twin brother from the beginning, she never would have been alone and my parents wouldn't have tried to have more children. She saw my existence as proof that her brother's loss had never been adequately acknowledged or grieved, and she transferred all her grief and anger about losing her twin onto me. My mother was crying now, saying they'd made so many mistakes in how they'd handled everything. They'd told Victoria about her twin too young, they'd let her idealize a relationship that never existed, they'd failed to help her process her grief healthily. And when I was born and Victoria rejected me, they'd hoped time would heal the rift rather than addressing the underlying issues. They'd watched Victoria's resentment grow for decades and had never found the right way to intervene or explain the complexity of the situation. I sat there trying to absorb this information. My sister's lifelong hatred of me wasn't really about me at all. It was about a brother who'd died before she'd even taken her first breath, a loss she'd mourned her entire life, and a grief that had curdled into rage directed at the living sibling she'd actually gotten. I was hated for not being someone else, for existing when he didn't, for being a sister when she'd wanted a brother. I asked my parents why they'd never told me this before, why they'd let me grow up thinking Victoria just naturally hated me for no reason beyond normal sibling rivalry. My mother said they'd convinced themselves it would get better, that Victoria would eventually work through her feelings and they could all move past it without having to burden me with the complicated history. They'd thought telling me would make me feel like I was somehow responsible for Victoria's unhappiness, which is exactly what had happened anyway without the explanation. My father added that they'd also been protecting their own pain. Talking about the lost twin meant acknowledging their own grief and trauma, things they'd tried to move past for decades. They'd wanted to believe that Victoria's problems were just about adjustment to a new sibling, not about deeply rooted grief and loss that they'd failed to help her process appropriately. I asked if Victoria knew they were telling me this, and my mother said no. After the dinner confrontation, they'd tried to talk to Victoria about her outburst and had realized that her pain was as raw as it had ever been. She'd spent 28 years resenting me for existing instead of grieving properly for the brother she'd lost. They'd decided it was finally time to be honest with me about the family history that had shaped both our lives. Over the next several days, I processed this information with help from Adam and my therapist. Understanding the roots of Victoria's resentment didn't make her treatment of me acceptable, but it did make it comprehensible. She'd been a 5-year-old child told about a twin brother who'd died, allowed to idealize that relationship, and then expected to accept a sister 8 years later as if that could replace or make up for what she'd lost. Our parents had failed both of us in different ways, Victoria by not helping her grieve healthily, and me by not explaining why I was so hated by someone who should have loved me. I tried to reach out to Victoria several times to see if we could talk about what our parents had revealed. She refused all contact, apparently still satisfied with her dinner confrontation and not interested in any deeper understanding or reconciliation. Through my parents, I heard that she maintained she'd been right to say what she said, that I had ruined her life, and that learning I now knew about her twin didn't change anything. The revelation has changed my relationship with my parents. I'm angry that they kept this secret for so long, that they let me grow up feeling my sister's hatred without understanding its source. But I also have compassion for their position, young parents dealing with unimaginable loss and then trying to navigate the complex grief of their surviving child while raising a second daughter who represented both hope and painful reminder. I've also had to grieve for an uncle I never knew existed, a twin who died before Victoria even knew him but whose loss shaped both our lives profoundly. If he'd survived, I might never have been born, or if I had been, the family dynamic would have been completely different. Victoria would have had the twin bond she'd always longed for, and perhaps she could have accepted me as an additional sibling rather than an inadequate replacement. Adam has been incredibly supportive through all of this, helping me process the complicated emotions of finally understanding Victoria's hatred while also validating that her treatment of me was unacceptable regardless of her pain. He's encouraged me to maintain boundaries with Victoria while working through my relationship with my parents. My parents have been trying to make amends, being more open about their feelings and the mistakes they made in handling Victoria's grief and our family dynamic. They've admitted they were in over their heads, that they didn't know how to help Victoria and thought time would heal wounds that actually needed active intervention. They've apologized for not telling me sooner, for letting me grow up feeling responsible for Victoria's unhappiness without understanding the complex history behind it. Victoria and I have had no contact since the dinner. I've left the door open for conversation if she ever wants to talk, but I'm not holding my breath. She spent 28 years hating me for existing instead of being her twin brother, and one revelation of family history isn't going to undo that. The damage is done, the resentment too deeply rooted, the relationships too fractured to repair. I've started to rebuild my understanding of my own life story with this new information. I grew up feeling like an unwanted burden, like my very existence was a problem that caused pain and difficulty. Now I understand that the pain I represented was about loss and grief that predated me, that I was born into a family still healing from trauma they'd never adequately processed. It doesn't excuse how I was treated, but it does explain it in ways that lift some of the burden I've carried. I'm also processing anger toward Victoria that I hadn't fully allowed myself before. Yes, she was dealing with complicated grief and had been failed by our parents in terms of getting help processing that grief. But she was also an adult for most of our relationship, someone with agency and the ability to seek help for her issues rather than taking them out on her innocent younger sister for decades. She chose cruelty over healing, resentment over therapy, and hatred over any attempt at reconciliation. My sister said I ruined her life by existing, and our parents finally told the truth about why. The truth was that her life was shaped by loss before I was ever born, by grief for a twin who died during delivery and whose death created a void she tried to fill with idealization and resentment. I wasn't her enemy, I was the living reminder of what she'd lost, the wrong sibling surviving in her mind, the substitution that could never be adequate. Understanding this doesn't repair our relationship. Victoria has made clear she's not interested in that. But it does give me peace about my own identity and worth. I didn't ruin anyone's life by being born. I was a wanted child, a loved child, even if one person couldn't see past her own pain enough to accept me. Victoria's pain is real and tragic, but it's not my responsibility to fix or to suffer for. She said I ruined her life by existing, but the truth is that her life was complicated by loss and grief that she never properly processed, and I became the scapegoat for pain that had nothing to do with me. That's tragic for both of us, but it's not my fault, and I'm finally learning to believe that.